My name is Michael. I'm 32. And if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that family can cut deeper than any stranger ever could. I've spent years building a career I'm proud of, working my way up from the lowest rung to a place I never thought I'd reach. But if you asked my dad about me, he wouldn't tell you any of that. He'd probably just shake his head and say I was still figuring things out, like I was some kind of aimless teenager instead of a grown man who's built something real. That's the thing about my dad. He's always been obsessed with appearances. Growing up, nothing I did ever seemed to measure up, not compared to my cousin, Kevin. Kevin was the golden child, the one who played varsity sports, got into the right college, and always seemed to have the family's admiration. I wasn't jealous, at least not anymore, but I knew exactly where I stood in the pecking order. If Kevin sneezed, the family sent him tissues. If I got promoted, my dad would say, "That's nice, Michael, but when are you going to do something really impressive?" So, when the family reunion rolled around this year, I should have known something was coming. My dad called me a few days before the event, his voice dripping with that familiar mix of forced cheer and subtle disdain. "Michael," he said, "maybe it's better if you sit this one out. Everyone's going to be there. And, well, your cousin's fiancé is flying in. He's an executive now. A real success story. I don't want you to feel overshadowed." I remember holding the phone to my ear, stunned. Not invited to my own family reunion because I might look small compared to someone else? I laughed at first, thinking he had to be joking, but when he didn't, the laugh died in my throat. I asked him straight out, "So, you're saying I shouldn't come because you think I'm a nobody compared to some guy marrying into the family?" There was a pause, and then he sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Don't take it so personally, Michael. It's just, well, we want the best impression for everyone. You know how it is." That was the moment the switch flipped inside me. I'd dealt with his condescension my whole life, brushed it off, buried myself in work, told myself it didn't matter. But this was different. He was cutting me out of my own family, dismissing me like I was an embarrassment he needed to hide. I told him fine. If that's how he felt, then he wouldn't have to worry about me showing up at all. I hung up before he could respond, my chest tight and my mind spinning. For days after, I couldn't shake it. I'd go to work, sit in my office, lead meetings, and all the while, his words echoed in the back of my mind. "You're a nobody." Funny thing was, I wasn't a nobody, not by a long shot. And the fiancé he was bragging about? Well, let's just say I knew him better than my dad could possibly imagine. But I'll get to that. Because before the reunion, before everything unfolded, there was this one moment that stuck with me. I was looking at an old photo album my mom had sent me when she was cleaning out the attic last year. There was a photo of me at 12, holding up a science fair ribbon with this big grin on my face. In the corner of the picture, you could see my dad clapping, but even then, even in that frozen moment, his smile looked strained, like pride didn't come naturally when it came to me. I think that's when I realized this wasn't about Kevin or the fiancé or anyone else. This was about him never being able to see me as enough. So, when the reunion night finally came, I made a choice. My dad didn't want me there? Fine. But I had every right to show up. And more than that, I had a card up my sleeve that no one in that family gathering was expecting. And when I walked into that room, the look on my dad's face told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just surprised I came. He was terrified of what might happen next. But that's getting ahead of myself. The real twist started when my cousin introduced her fiancé to the family. That's when everything shifted, and suddenly, the ground my dad had been standing on for years wasn't as solid as he thought. When I walked through the door of the rented banquet hall where the reunion was held, the air shifted. The chatter dipped, forks clinked against plates, and then all eyes turned to me. I caught my dad's expression first. He froze mid-conversation with Kevin, his mouth tightening like he'd just bitten into something sour. It was the kind of look you give when someone crashes a party they weren't invited to. Only this was my own family, and I wasn't crashing anything. "Michael," he said after a beat, his voice forced into a flat kind of politeness. "I thought we talked about this." His tone wasn't welcoming. It was a warning. I shrugged like I hadn't noticed the tension. "Yeah, we did. And I decided I'd come anyway. It's family, isn't it?" That was when Kevin swooped in, ever the golden boy. He threw an arm around me in that fake, friendly way people do when they want to show off their magnanimity. "Hey, Michael. Glad you could make it, man. We were just talking about Paul. You know, my fiancé. He's got this incredible new position, vice president now, right, babe?" He glanced over his shoulder, beaming like he'd just won the lottery. And there he was, Paul, my cousin's fiancé. The same Paul who, only 3 days earlier, had been sitting across from me in my office, nervously explaining why his division's numbers weren't adding up. The same Paul who had to address me with, "Yes, sir," and, "Of course, Mr. Sterling." Because Paul wasn't just some executive, he was my executive. And while my dad saw him as this untouchable success story, I knew better. I knew exactly how precarious Paul's job was and who held the power over it. But I didn't let that show. Not yet. I kept my face neutral even as the irony hit me square in the chest. Paul extended his hand. "Michael, right? Kevin's cousin." His smile was polished, the kind of practiced charm you wear to family events. I shook his hand firmly, maybe a little firmer than necessary, and said, "Yeah, we've met." If he recognized me in that moment, he didn't let on, but I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of uncertainty, like a shadow passing across his carefully curated image. Dinner was awkward. My dad had gone all out for Kevin and Paul, positioning them at the head of the table like royalty. People toasted to their bright future, and every compliment was another jab in my direction. My aunt gushed about how impressive it was that Paul had landed such a prestigious role. "Not many people your age can say that," she said, her gaze sliding past me like I wasn't even worth addressing. At one point, my dad clinked his glass for attention. "Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone," he started, his eyes flicking briefly to me, "but I just want to say how proud I am of Kevin and Paul. They've really made something of themselves. It's the kind of success story we can all look up to." He paused, then chuckled lightly. "Some of us are still finding our way, but that's okay. We can't all be stars." The table laughed politely. I didn't. I felt my face heat, the old mix of shame and anger boiling up. It was the same script he'd used my whole life. Highlight someone else's success, minimize mine, and leave me sitting there invisible. I pushed my food around my plate, fighting the urge to stand up and walk out. But then Kevin leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for me to hear over the clatter of cutlery. "Don't take it personally, Michael. Dad just wants to celebrate us. You know how it is. You've got your thing going on, whatever it is." I stared at him, incredulous. My thing going on. That was how he described the company I had built from the ground up, the one that employed over 100 people and had landed contracts that Paul's team now depended on. And then, as if the night hadn't humiliated me enough, my father added one final twist of the knife. "By the way, Michael, I hope you don't mind, but we didn't set a place for you in the main seating. There's a smaller table in the back. You'll be more comfortable there." I looked over. Sure enough, tucked against the wall, away from the main circle of conversation, was a lonely table set for one, like I was a child being sent to the kids' corner, or, worse, an outsider not meant to be part of the group at all. I sat down at that table, separated, humiliated, but not defeated. Because while my dad and the rest of them thought they'd put me in my place, what they didn't realize was that the real game hadn't even started yet, and the first cracks in their perfect little picture were about to show. From my little table against the wall, I had the perfect view of everyone else. They were laughing, toasting, and clinking glasses like it was some royal banquet. While I sat with nothing but my plate of food that had already gone cold, I tried to focus on breathing, telling myself not to react, not to give my father the satisfaction of seeing me crack. But then something happened that cut deeper than I expected. Dessert was being served when my mom stood up with a smile. She held out a small, wrapped box and walked straight toward Kevin and Paul. "We wanted you to have this," she said, her voice warm and proud. It belonged to Michael's grandfather. He always said he'd pass it down to the one in the family who showed the most promise. I froze. My grandfather's watch, a vintage piece he'd worn every day of his life, the one I used to wind for him when I was a kid, sitting on his lap. He used to say, "One day this will be yours, Michael. You'll understand the value of hard work." And now, in front of everyone, my parents were handing it to Kevin's fiancée. Not even Kevin. Paul. A man who wasn't even blood. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My chest tightened, my vision blurred at the edges. That was supposed to be mine. I muttered under my breath, but no one heard. Or maybe they did, and they just chose to ignore it. Kevin clapped Paul on the back. "See, babe? Even Grandpa would have been proud of you." Paul smiled awkwardly, clearly unsure what to say. He looked down at the box, then glanced at me across the room. For a split second, our eyes locked. His smile faltered, and I could tell. He knew. He knew the watch didn't belong in his hands. But he also knew this wasn't the time to make a scene. My dad noticed me staring. "Michael," he said loudly, so the whole table turned to look. "Don't sulk. It's just a watch. Symbols like that belong with the ones who represent the family best. And let's be honest, you've always been different." The laughter that followed was softer this time, more hesitant. Even some of the relatives shifted uncomfortably, like they weren't sure this had gone too far. But for me, the damage was done. It wasn't just favoritism anymore. It was theft. Theft of something promised, something sacred. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. All those years of being overlooked, dismissed, pushed aside. This was the breaking point. Not because of the watch itself, but because of what it represented. It was the final stamp of disapproval, the undeniable statement that I was not, and never would be, enough in my father's eyes. I thought back to all the times I had stayed late at the office, building something real, while everyone else in the family laughed about how boring I was. I thought of the countless nights I went home alone, too exhausted to do anything but fall into bed, while Kevin flaunted his vacations and new cars. I had sacrificed, endured, and achieved. And yet, here I was, being erased from my own family's legacy in favor of someone marrying into it. And the cruelest part? My father didn't even flinch. He stood tall, grinning as if this was the most natural thing in the world. That was the moment something hardened inside me. Whatever connection I had left to them, snapped. If they wanted to treat me like an outsider, then fine, I'd play the role. But I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. I leaned back in my chair, forcing myself to appear calm, even as my hands trembled under the table. Across the room, Paul still hadn't put on the watch. His fingers hovered over the box like it was a live wire. He kept sneaking glances at me, his forehead creased. He knew something wasn't right. And when he finally put the pieces together who I was, where we stood, things were going to get very, very interesting. Because my family thought they had broken me that night. What they didn't know was that the betrayal had only given me fuel, and the game I was about to play would make their favoritism look like child's play. The rest of the night blurred together, but the sting of that moment with the watch clung to me like a shadow. I stayed at my little table while the celebration carried on without me, laughter bouncing off the walls as if I weren't even there. People passed by with plates of food, fresh drinks, slices of cake, yet no one stopped to ask if I wanted any. It was as if the empty seat at their main table symbolized my place in the family. Invisible, disposable. I kept my composure, but inside I was unraveling. Every time I heard my dad raise his glass for yet another toast to Kevin and Paul, it felt like a reminder that I wasn't wanted. Not as a son, not as a cousin, not as part of this family at all. The watch was gone. My seat was gone. And maybe, if I was honest with myself, the illusion that I still belonged was gone, too. At one point, my mom came by, not to comfort me, but to ask if I could be a little less stiff so people wouldn't think I was sulking. Her words stung worse than I expected. I managed a tight smile and said nothing. What could I say? That I had been humiliated in front of everyone I grew up with? That something sacred had been stolen from just the watch, but the respect I had always longed for? I slipped out onto the balcony to get some air, away from the clinking glasses and false cheer. The night was cool, and the faint hum of crickets in the distance was almost soothing. For a moment, I thought about leaving altogether, just walking to my car, driving home, and letting them keep their twisted version of family. No confrontation, no drama, no revenge. Just silence. But as I stood there, staring at the dark stretch of road beyond the parking lot, I realized silence was exactly what they counted on from me. My father had spent years conditioning me to shrink myself, to accept being overlooked. And this reunion, with its staged humiliation, was the culmination of that. If I walked away now, I'd be proving him right. Still, I didn't rush back inside. I needed time to think, to breathe, to collect myself. The truth about Paul was still burning in the back of my mind, but I knew I couldn't reveal it yet. Not in anger, not when my emotions were raw. If I lashed out too soon, I'd look bitter and petty, the way my dad had always painted me. So, I stayed on the balcony, staring at the lights inside the hall, listening to the muffled sound of my family celebrating without me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to admit the pain out loud, even if only to the night air. They'll never see me, I whispered. Not unless I make them. And that's when the shift happened. Beneath the ache in my chest, a cold clarity began to form. If they couldn't see me as someone worth respecting, then I would show them in a way they couldn't ignore. Not with yelling, not with desperate pleas for approval, but with quiet, deliberate action. When I finally walked back into the hall, no one seemed to notice. They were too busy cheering as Kevin and Paul posed for pictures, holding up glasses of champagne. My father's arm was draped proudly around Kevin's shoulder, his face glowing with satisfaction. I sat back at my table in silence, my expression calm. But inside, something had hardened. That night, I drove home later than I intended. The roads were empty, my headlights cutting through the dark. The ache of betrayal still lingered, but underneath it, I felt a new kind of resolve. My family thought they had pushed me down to rock bottom. But what they didn't realize was that rock bottom makes a solid foundation to build something unshakable. And as for Paul, well, he wasn't going to stay just my cousin's fiancé for long. Soon, everyone would know exactly who he answered to and what that meant for the family that had cast me aside. The week after the reunion, I buried myself in work, not out of obligation, but out of sheer determination. I'd already built something strong, but now it felt different, personal. Every hour I spent reviewing contracts, every decision I made for the company, every late night I stayed in my office with the city skyline glowing through the windows, it was all fuel. My father's words, that bitter dismissal of me as a nobody, echoed in my head, and instead of crushing me, they became a drumbeat I marched to. The truth was, my company had been thriving long before the reunion. Years of sweat, setbacks, and stubborn persistence had paid off. We'd landed deals with firms my dad couldn't even pronounce, and our profits had tripled in the past 18 months. I'd gone from begging banks for loans to sitting in boardrooms with investors who hung on my every word. But I had never flaunted it, not to my family, not to anyone. I thought my success would speak for itself someday. That night at the reunion proved me wrong. If I wanted them to see, I had to show them directly. Ironically, Paul gave me the opening I needed. His division had been underperforming for months. I knew it. He knew it, and sooner or later, the rest of the board would know it, too. At the reunion, when he accepted that watch with shaky hands, I could tell he realized there was more between us than my family suspected. And if he didn't, then he certainly would when the next quarterly review came around. Meanwhile, my own life outside of work was starting to look different. For once, I stopped trying to earn my family's approval and began focusing on people who actually valued me. A few close friends, colleagues who respected what I built, even a mentor I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them reminded me that worth isn't measured by blood ties or parental praise. It's measured by the life you carve out for yourself, piece by piece. There were small but powerful victories. Signing a multi-million-dollar contract with a client that Paul's team had been courting for months. Seeing my company's name splashed across a major business magazine with my face on the cover. Walking into meetings where people stood to shake my hand first. Each success was like a quiet strike against the years of belittlement. And yet, I didn't brag. I didn't call my dad and wave it in his face. I let it build, steady and undeniable, like a storm gathering on the horizon. My father thought Paul was the crown jewel of the family, the example everyone should follow. Soon they would all see the truth, that Paul's polished exterior hid cracks, and that I, the son they had written off, was the one holding all the real power. Late one night, sitting in my office, I caught myself staring at the city lights again. I remembered that moment on the balcony at the reunion, whispering that they'd never see me unless I made them. I realized then that I wasn't just planning a reveal, I was preparing a reckoning, one they wouldn't be able to laugh off or dismiss as me still finding my way. Because the irony was too perfect, my father had paraded Paul as the pinnacle of success, not realizing Paul's entire career now rested on my decisions. And the higher I rose, the clearer it became. If Paul faltered, if his numbers slipped, if his polished charm failed to cover his mistakes, well, it wouldn't just be his job on the line. It would be my father's pride. His golden pedestal would crumble. I didn't rush it. That was the hardest part, patience. But with every success, every subtle shift in power, I felt myself moving closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. And when it came, I knew it wouldn't just be about Paul. It would be about all of them, my father, my cousin, every relative who had looked at me like I didn't belong. They'd see exactly who the nobody had become. It started small, the kind of cracks you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for them. Paul's division kept slipping. Missed targets, bloated budgets, client complaints brushed under the rug. At first, he smoothed things over with his usual polished charm, the same easy smile he'd worn at the reunion. But charm only carries you so far in business. Numbers don't care about charisma, and I was the one who got the reports first. By the second quarter review, the board was restless. Paul presented his slides confidently, but I saw the sweat at his collar, the way his voice tightened on certain figures. When the room emptied afterward, one of the board members leaned toward me and said, You'll need to keep a close eye on him. His leash can't get much longer. I nodded calmly, hiding the spark of satisfaction burning inside me. That night, I went home and pulled out the old photo album my mom had given me again. I stared at the picture of me and my grandfather, the one with the ribbon. The memory of the watch still cut deep, but now it served as a reminder. My father had thought he could rewrite the family legacy by handing that watch to Paul. What he didn't know was that I held the real inheritance, power, influence, and the final say over whether Paul's career sank or swam. The setup came faster than I expected. A client Paul's team had been struggling with reached out directly to me, frustrated with delays. It was the kind of call that bypasses excuses and lands squarely in leadership's lap. I took the meeting personally, assured them of our company's commitment, and closed the deal within a week. The client was happy, the contract was saved, but Paul's failure was plain for everyone to see. It wasn't just business, though. A cousin of mine mentioned casually that Kevin and Paul were planning to host a family dinner soon, a smaller follow-up to the reunion. They want to celebrate Paul's achievements, she said. I smiled politely, but inside I knew this was a perfect stage. Another night of my father showering Paul with praise, blind to the fact that his star was hanging by a thread, and that thread was in my hand. Still, I didn't rush. I played my role carefully, the quiet professional who didn't boast. I let Paul sweat through another month of shaky reports. I let my father gush at every family gathering about how lucky Kevin was to have found such a successful fiancé. All the while, I gathered information, client feedback, financial discrepancies, even a few questionable expense reports that Paul had signed off on. I wasn't going to use them recklessly, but I kept them tucked away, knowing that one day soon they might tip the balance. Then came the board notice, an emergency performance review for Paul's division. I'd been asked to oversee it personally. The timing couldn't have been better. The family dinner was the following weekend. I sat in my office late one evening, the city quiet outside my window, and thought about my father's words at the reunion. Some of us are still finding our way. I smiled to myself. No, I wasn't finding my way anymore. I'd already found it, and now I was preparing to show them. Because soon, when my family gathered again to celebrate Paul, they'd see the truth with their own eyes. And this time, it wouldn't be me sitting in the corner at the kids' table. It would be Paul if he was lucky enough to have a seat at all. The family dinner was smaller than the reunion, but just as polished. Kevin had rented out a private dining room in an upscale restaurant downtown. White tablecloths, soft lighting, waiters gliding around with bottles of wine. Everyone arrived dressed to impress, and just like before, Paul was the centerpiece. My dad beamed as he shook his hand at the door, clapping him on the back like he was the son he wished he'd had. "Michael," my father said when he saw me, his smile tightening. "Didn't expect you here." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied smoothly. My voice was calm, even pleasant, but inside I was steadying myself. Tonight wasn't about anger, it was about precision. I took my seat and listened as the evening unfolded. Toasts, laughter, endless praise for Paul's success. My aunt leaned across the table at one point and whispered, "You should take notes, Michael. Paul's career is the kind of path anyone would be lucky to follow." I just smiled and nodded, letting the words roll off me. Halfway through the meal, Kevin stood up to make a speech. He went on about how proud he was of Paul, how his fiancée was a role model not just for him, but for the whole family. My father applauded loudly, calling out, "Hear, hear." Everyone raised their glasses, and that was when I decided it was time. I waited for the room to settle, then leaned forward slightly. "Speaking of Paul's career," I said, my voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear, "there's something you should all know." The table quieted. Paul stiffened, his fork frozen halfway to his plate. My father frowned. "Michael, this isn't the time for one of your interruptions." "Oh, I think it's the perfect time," I said calmly. "You've all gone on about Paul's accomplishments. But what none of you seem to realize is that Paul works for me." The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. Forks clinked against plates. Chairs shifted. My cousin blinked in confusion. "Wait, what?" Paul cleared his throat. "He's exaggerating," he tried to say, forcing a laugh. "I don't work for him." I cut him off, still calm, still steady. "Paul is a vice president in my company. His division has been under review for underperformance, which I suppose makes me not such a nobody after all." My father's face drained of color. He looked from me to Paul, then back again, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't quite form words. My mother set down her glass, her hand trembling slightly. Around the table, whispers started to ripple. Paul tried to recover. "That's not entirely fair. The numbers." I raised a hand. No need to explain here. We'll be addressing the numbers at the board meeting next week. But since you've all made such a show of celebrating Paul's success, I thought you might want to know the truth. His position is precarious, and whether he keeps it or not is entirely up to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply laid out the facts, clear and undeniable, and the effect was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Kevin's smile collapsed. My father looked like he'd been slapped. My aunt, who told me to take notes, sat frozen, her cheeks flushed. And Paul looked like a man whose mask had been ripped away in front of a crowd. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my wine. So, Dad, I said, quietly enough that only those closest could hear, who's the nobody? And that was when the room truly shifted. The silence that hung over the table after my words was almost unbearable. You could hear the faint hum of the restaurant staff outside the closed doors, the clink of silverware in distant rooms. But at our table, there was nothing, just the stunned faces of my family staring at me as if I'd turned into someone they'd never met before. Kevin was the first to break. Wait, this has to be some kind of joke, right? His voice cracked, and he looked from Paul to me, desperate for reassurance. Paul's face was pale, his jaw tight. It's not exactly how it sounds, he muttered, but no one bought it. The damage was already done. My father leaned forward, his face reddening, his voice sharp. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you ever say? I cut him off, calm as ever, because it never mattered to you. You didn't care who I was or what I built. You only cared how I compared to Kevin or to whoever else you thought made you look good. I stopped trying to prove myself to you years ago. Tonight was just about letting you see what you've been blind to all along. He sat back, stunned into silence. Across the table, my aunt whispered, "Oh my," while my uncle cleared his throat and looked down at his plate, clearly embarrassed for ever joining in my father's mockery. Even my mother, always so quick to defend him, couldn't meet my eyes. She stared at her napkin instead, twisting it in her hands. Paul tried to salvage what little dignity he had left. Look, I may work under Michael, but that doesn't change who I am. But Kevin slammed his glass down, his face red with humiliation. It changes everything. You've been parading around this family like you're some untouchable success, and all this time, you've been lying by omission. Do you know how ridiculous this makes me look? The brothers' argument spiraled quickly, Kevin blaming Paul trying to deflect. My father, for once, didn't jump in to save Kevin. He just sat there staring at me with a hollow expression, like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he'd never really tried to. I didn't stay for dessert. I stood, placed my napkin neatly on the table, and said, "Thank you for dinner. I think I've seen enough." I could feel every pair of eyes on me as I walked to the door. Paul was sweating. Kevin's face was buried in his hands. My father sat frozen in humiliation, and my mother looked like she might cry. As I pushed the door open, I paused and glanced back just once. "You spent years telling me I was a nobody," I said, my voice steady. "Turns out the only people who didn't see me were you." And then I left, the door closing softly behind me. That night, driving home through the quiet streets, I felt something lift off my chest. The weight of their disapproval, the years of chasing validation, it was gone. They could keep their empty toasts, their favoritism, their shallow praise. I had my own life, my own success, and finally, the truth was undeniable. The next week, Paul's division was formally placed under my direct oversight. His title remained on paper, but his power was gone. At family gatherings after that, the tone shifted. No more digs, no more dismissive comments. If anything, they were careful now, tiptoeing around me, unsure of what to say. But I didn't need their approval anymore. That night at the dinner had been my closure. Because in the end, revenge wasn't about humiliating them. It was about reclaiming myself. And as I looked at the city lights from my office window, I thought about my father's words at the reunion. Some of us are still finding our way. I smiled. I've already found mine.